Good morning, everyone. Today we're taking a brief look at some of the texts in Jeremiah chapter 14 and verse 7 through chapter 15 and verse 9. This section begins with Jeremiah identifying himself with his people and acting as their spokesman. He's pleading with God for help and deliverance as he confesses the nation's past and present sins. Now, the only reason that Jeremiah offers to God for God to act in Israel's behalf is for the sake of his reputation and his honor. Verse 7. Of course, as you know, that's not going to be enough for God to change his plans. The people need to change their ways. Chapter 14 and verse 12 reminds us of the futility of religious exercises when those exercises are not accompanied by obedience. Fasting, burnt offerings, and grain offerings are not acceptable to the Lord in the absence of obedience. Boy, won't that point preach today. In chapter 14 and verse 15, Jeremiah's attention turns to the false prophets, about whom God says, I did not speak to them, I did not send them, and they are speaking lies. And God says that they will be the first ones to fall by the sword and by famine, but they would be followed by the gullible and faithless people who listened to them. For today, God, help us to distinguish between false and true teaching that comes from you. In chapter 14, verses 19 through 22, we have another one of Jeremiah's confessions. And God's answer to that confession is in chapter 15, verses 1 through 4. And boy, isn't it interesting? God uses two of the great intercessors in Israel's history, Moses and Samuel, to make his point. You might recall times when Moses and Samuel both pled to God for God to change what he intended to do when his people sinned. And usually, their intercession caused God to change his plans. But in Jeremiah's day, God's people had declined so far from their covenant that even the prayers of Moses and Samuel, much less those of Jeremiah, could turn God's heart toward the people. Their sin was just too deep. And these images in chapter 15, verses 1 through 4, are so horrific as God speaks of 4 kinds of destroyers that are coming against his people. And I've got to tell you that when I read that passage, I asked myself, I wonder, Lord, if your people today don't need to look in the mirror and ask, how might we have sinned? How might we have refused to listen to the Lord and do his will? How might we have refused to obey him that would bring upon us this kind of judgment? I think it's something for us to think about. Now, a quick preview of chapter 15, verse 10 through chapter 16, verse 13. Actually, we are entering a new section that will carry us through Jeremiah chapter 25. And in this section, we're going to read about Jeremiah's confessions. We're going to read about some of the symbolic actions that he performed to communicate God's message to God's people. And we're going to read about Jeremiah's preaching. It's going to be very interesting. In today's reading, 15 verses 10 through 14, we read about Jeremiah's inner struggle and God's answer. And you gotta love Jeremiah's openness with God, right? His honesty, his transparency, his willingness to tell God how he feels. We will come upon another one of his confessions and God's answer in chapter 15, verses 15 through 21. I think that's for tomorrow. And then, in chapter 16, verses 1 through 13, we're going to read about Jeremiah's life, which became a mirror of his message of judgment. God's going to instruct Jeremiah not to take a wife. And one of the purposes for that is to be a living illustration to Israel. This is what God has said to Israel, and it will be illustrated in the events of Jeremiah's own life. Interesting reading. I'll see you again soon.